What's the #1 coolest, most amazing feature in InDesign? Well, XML, of course. No, I'm just kidding. It's transparency, and we've already looked at how InDesign can import images with transparency. Now let's take a step farther and look at how you can apply transparency effects to any object in InDesign. I have my Roo Flyer document open from my exercise files folder, and I'd like to apply an interesting transparency effect to this word, art. So I'll select it and then zoom in to 200% by pressing Command 2 on the Mac or Control 2 on Windows. Now I'm going to open my Control Central for all transparency effects, that is, the Effects panel. I have it over here in my dock, so I'll just click on it. If you don't see it in your dock, then either switch to your workspace to Advanced or go to the Window menu and choose Effects. You can apply a transparency effect to any object on your page, whether it's a graphic frame, a text frame, a line, or whatever. The first thing we're going to do here is change the opacity, here in the upper right corner. That's how transparent this object should be. Right now it's set to 100%, so you can't see through it at all. But if I click here on the word opacity, that selects that field, so I can type 50 and then return or enter. And now, all the text, the whole object, is 50% opaque or 50% transparent. I can also use this little slider to the right of the field to increase or decrease the opacity. Now, the second transparency effect you can apply here is the blending mode. That's the pop-up menu over here on the left. Right now, the blending mode is set to normal, but you can see that we have a lot of different options here. Almost all the options from Photoshop and Illustrator show up here. So, for example, we could change this to multiply. That kind of burns the effect in. Or we could choose screen. Screen is just the opposite of multiply. It's kind of like shining lights on a screen. Multiply always makes the effect darker, screen always makes it lighter. I should point out that if you want to see your transparency effects as best as possible, you should go to the View menu, choose the Display Performance submenu, and then choose High Quality Display. That way you can see the high-resolution images and high-quality transparency effects. It won't affect how it's going to print out, but it does make them look better on screen. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now I want to pay attention to this white box up here. I'll select that, and then I'll press Command- on my keyboard or Control- a couple times. When I do that, it zooms out and centers it on the screen. This white frame with all this black text in it looks pretty good, but I'd like to see through the white a little bit. Now, I could select this, and then go to my Effects panel and change the opacity to, say, 70%. But the problem with this is that it makes the entire object 70% opaque. That is, I can see through the background, but I can also see through the text. It made that black text kind of gray text. I don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and set that back to 100%. Instead, what I want to do is change the opacity of the background fill, but not the text. Fortunately, the Effects panel lets me do that. It all has to do with what is selected in this list. Right now, Object is selected, which means that the opacity and blending modes are going to be applied to the entire object. But in this case, I'm going to choose Fill. Now, any change I make in the Effects panel will only affect the fill of this object. So again, I'll change this to 70%. You might not see such a big difference here on the screen, but believe me, it makes a big difference. The background fill is transparent, but the text is nice and solid. By the way, you don't have to open the Effects panel to do all of these things. Even if the Effects panel were closed, you can still get to many of those effects up here in the Control panel. It's this area over here. For example, I could change the transparency from 70% up to 80%. That makes it a little bit less transparent. I can also tell InDesign what part of the object to affect in this pop-up menu over here. That's the same thing as selecting one of those items from the list inside the Effects panel. Changing the opacity or blending mode of an object is cool, but it's just the beginning when it comes to InDesign's transparency features. In the next few movies, we'll look at some of the most common transparency effects, starting with everyone's favorite, the drop shadow.